In this lab, you will be creating the Westlake database for the Westlake Research Hospital. In this lab, we are going to use what we've already done in the previous labs, and this is for the Group A labs. Previously, we created the physical design. The physical design will look very similar to what you see on my screen now. We're going to use that physical design, the one that's provided for us in the book, to create the database. We'll begin by opening up Management Studio Express. If it's not already open, you're going to use the Connect Object Explorer to bring up the window to connect to your database. You're going to log into your database. I'm going to be using my SA account. And once logged in, you'll see a tree on the left-hand side, and you're going to expand databases. You'll see in mine I have no databases, but yours, you may have the ActionWorks database. I'm going to right-click and click on New Database to create my database. The name of my database is Westlake. I'm going to click Add. Sorry, you clicked Add, hit Remove. I'm going to put Westlake. I meant to click OK, so I'm going to click OK. When the box goes away, you'll see your Westlake database now displays under the databases in the databases tree. Of course, we have no tables yet, so the first thing we'll need to do is create some tables. The first table we'll create is the doctor's table, which here is in the center. It says Table 1, which is a mistake from our textbook. But we're going to make that the doctor's table, and that table is going to contain two columns, the doctor key, which will be the primary key, and the doctor name. To create your table, you're going to right-click on Tables, select New Table. When this dialog displays, under column name, we'll type our column name. So the first column I'm going to use is Dr. Key. The data type for this column is going to be nchar 50. And we're going to uncheck Allow Nulls. For the second column, we're going to use Dr. Name with a data type of varchar 50. Note that we also uncheck Allow Nulls for this column. Once you've completed this, once your table looks similar to this, obviously here it's called Table 1 in the tab at the top. When we hit Control S to save, we can give it a new name. I'm going to call mine Doctor. Once that's saved, we can close this tab. And if we right-click and refresh, you'll now see the doctor table. And if we open up the tree, you'll see the two columns, Dr. Key and the doctor name. But we have to make the Dr. Key the primary key. To do this, we can right-click on Doctor and click to go to Design Mode. This is how we can edit a table after we've already created it. So if I right-click on Dr. Key, I can hit Select Primary, and it is now the primary key. I should be able to hit Control S to save that table. It's now saved, and I can close it. When I right-click and refresh, when I look at my columns, you'll see that the Dr. Key column now has the icon for the key. Next, we're going to create the patient's table. Note that the patient's table has both a primary key and a foreign key. The patient key column is the primary key, and the doctor key column will be the foreign key. So let's make this table. We'll do this in the same way. We're going to right-click on Tables. We'll create a new table, and we'll fill in these columns. So note the data types. Some of the data types are nchar, and some are varchar. It's important to note the difference between nchar and varchar, especially how it will store that data in the database. This would be a good discussion point. Under the Allow Nulls, presumably the middle name and the phone number could be optional in this database. So we allow nulls, so if someone does not insert a value, they're still able to create a record in that table. We also need to make the patient key the primary key, so we're going to right-click and hit Set Primary. We're now ready to save this table. I'm going to hit Control S, and I'm going to call this table Patient. You can see in my refreshed list, I now have both a doctor and a patient table. I'm going to expand the patient table so you can see the column names. This would be a good point to pause to make sure that your column names are the same as my column names. If you need to make a change to your table, simply right-click, click on Design, and you can make your changes. It's important to note that if you try to make changes after you've added table or added data to your table, it may not be able to save. So it's important to get this correct. Although, in many cases, you can make edits by using the SQL command line. Next, we'll create the dropped patients table. And the dropped patients table is going to have 3 columns. So make sure that your table looks similar to the table that I've created here. And when you're done, you'll save this table. And we're going to call it dropped patients. Up to this point, we've used the graphical user interface to create our tables. However, we can also create tables using SQL. To do that, you're going to click on the button at the top that says New Query. You should have a New Query button. In some cases, you can right-click and click New Query on your database. So I'm going to click the button for a new query. And in this window, I can type my SQL command. So for example, here we have create table. The table name is groups. The first column is group key, which is the primary key. And the second column is group description, which cannot be null. So you can type the same command on your SQL console. And once you're ready, you'll click the button at the top that says execute. If you want to check for errors first, you can click the parse button, the checkbox. That'll verify you have no errors in your SQL syntax. And then once you're ready, click on execute, and you'll see that the command is completed successfully. To verify you've created the table, you can see here that we do not have a groups table. But if I right-click and refresh, I now have my groups table, and it contains the 2 columns, the group key and the group description. Pause the video and do the same command in your database. Finally, the last table we need to create is the patient groups, which is a linking table. So we have the patients table and a groups table. Since many patients can be in many groups, we have to use a linking table to connect those 2 tables, which we've talked about in class. In order to do that, we're going to create our new table. But before we do that, we need to take a look at the columns that we have under patient and groups, because we have to think about the foreign keys. Notice that the primary key for groups is the group key, and the primary key for patient is the patient key. And the data types for both of those is nchar. In my groups table, I've made an error where the data type or for the group key is an nchar, but it's only 5 characters rather than 15. So I'm going to update mine to be 15 characters. So I'm going to right-click on groups, go to design mode, and I'm going to edit this to 15 characters. When I try to save, it says that saving changes is not permitted. So you can't save changes using the graphical user interface. So we're going to have to make this change using SQL. So back to my screen where I have my create table statement. I'm going to add to this statement a drop. So I'm going to type drop table groups. And this will first drop the table. And I'm going to make sure that that happens first by typing the go command. So it's going to drop the table groups. Next, I'm going to go to the typo from our textbook where they had nchar 5. I'm going to change that to 15, which is the intended value, and type go after that. So it just created our first SQL script. It'll first drop the groups table. Then it's going to create a table again, calling it groups, but this time with an nchar of 15, with a length of 15. It's important that this be set to 15 since the primary key in this table is going to also be a foreign key in another table, and we want both of those to be the same length. I'm fairly certain that this is a typo in the book, so we're going to make this change. So once we made those changes to the script, then we're going to click on execute, and it should complete the statement. Now when I right-click on my groups table and refresh, I now have an nchar 15 rather than an nchar 5. Pause the video, write that script, and execute it. We're now ready to create our patient group assignment. So our patient group assignment is going to have a patient key and the group key. The patient key is going to be the primary key. If you're going to use the GUI to create this table, I'm going to right-click on Table, click on New Table, and I'm going to type in my 2 column names. So once you've typed these 2 group names, don't forget to right-click and set your primary key for the patient key, which should match our diagram, which shows the patient key as the primary key. We'll create the foreign keys in just a few minutes. So pause the video and type in these column names, and then we'll save this. So to save this, I'm going to hit Control S, and I'm going to call it patient group assignment. Now when I right-click and refresh my tables, I have my doctor, drop patient, groups, and patient tables. We're now ready to do our database diagram. So under your Westlake database, the first object, the first folder you should see in the tree is going to be database diagrams. You're going to right-click and click New Database Diagram. Now I have the Add Table dialog. On some of your database engines, it's going to tell you that you're lacking certain components in order to create the database diagram. Just click Yes, and then you should get this dialog. Once this dialog appears, we're going to add all of these tables to our diagram. So if you keep clicking Add, you'll have all of your database tables in the diagram, and you'll be able to arrange these tables by clicking and dragging them on the screen. If some of the tables are off screen, you may have to scroll over. So I'm going to scroll back, and then we're going to arrange these tables similar to the way they're arranged in the book. So take a moment to arrange your tables similar to how you see it on my screen. You can pause the video, and once you have your tables arranged in the same way, then we'll create our relationships. So the database diagram utility allows us to create our foreign key relationships. So the database engine knows how these tables relate to one another. It's a graphical utility, so we can click, for example, on the doctor key, and then we can drag it to the table to which it's related. In this case, my doctor relates to the patient on the doctor key. When you release, you'll see this dialog box. You'll select your table and then the keys. So in my doctor table, it is the doctor key. And in my foreign table, it is also the doctor key. So we're going to have the doctor key on both sides. Now notice on the left-hand side over here, I have my doctor key in the doctor table has an nchar 50, which is an error that I made when creating that table, where my patient table's doctor key is an nchar 15. And if you recall, if our primary key and foreign keys don't match data types, then we cannot create a foreign key. One is an nchar and the other one is a varchar. So I have to modify the data type on the doctor key and the doctor key on the patient level. I have to make sure both of the same data type and the same length. So I need to change the length of the doctor key in the doctor table to 15 as opposed to 50. So to do that, I'm going to cancel these windows. I'm going to show you a little trick. If I right-click on a table, you can click Script Table As, Create to, New Query Window. So this will automatically create a database script to generate that table. So let's try that. So again, you're going to right-click on Doctor, Script Table As, Create to, New Query Window. Now you can see that this query looks much more complicated than the previous query. The first section here tells SQL to use the Westlake database, so make sure that we're in the correct database. There's some things going on here that we really don't need. And since we're already in the Westlake database, we can delete all that content. Down here, this is a different way to create a primary key. The way we did it when we wrote the script was much simpler, but this is really the correct way to do it. So we're going to leave that part. We also don't need this padding on the bottom, so we'll get rid of that. So this is the database script to generate our database. The change we want to make is to edit the doctor key to be only 15 characters as opposed to 50. If you recall, in order to get rid of that table, we can use drop table doctor. I'll type go to make sure that that happens first. This should drop the table first and then recreate it with an nchar 15 for the doctor key field. So I'm going to click execute. Command completed successfully. I right click on doctor and refresh. I now have the correct length. It's important to note that if you did this with data in the table, all of your data would be lost. So this is convenient while we're trying to design our database, but we would not want to do this after our database is in production. So it's really important to get the design correct before you begin using the database. Pause the video for a few minutes and do the same procedure I did to drop and recreate your table with the correct length for that field. In order to create this foreign key relationship, since the properties of this table are cached in the database diagram tab, we have to close that tab, and then we're going to reopen it by hitting new database diagram. And once again, we have to add all of our tables and rearrange them similar to the textbook. Now in my database, in order for me to create that relationship, because it cached the previous column data types from when I created the database diagram before, I actually had to disconnect by clicking the button in the Object Explorer to disconnect and then reconnect to my database. You may have to do the same thing. If so, once you reconnect, we're going to go back to database diagrams, click new database diagram, add our tables, and arrange them as in the textbook. Take a moment to make sure that your screen is just as mine. And once you're ready, we're going to click on the key for doctor key, and we're going to drag it to the doctor key in the patient table. If you're careful to drag to the same column name, it'll automatically select both in this dialog. And then once you click OK, it'll create your relationship. Once that relationship is created, you're going to create the rest of your relationships. So I'm going to use my dropped patient and drag the patient key to the patient key. Click OK. I now have a one-to-one relationship between patient and dropped patient using the patient key in both tables. I'm going to do the same thing for the patient group assignment. I'm going to drag that patient key to the patient key. Click OK. And then finally, the group key to the group assignment. And then I'll click OK. Take a moment to make those relationships just like I did. Once you've completed your diagram, we're going to save it. I'm going to hit Control S to save it on my system. I'm just going to leave it as diagram 0 and click OK. So it's letting me know that it's going to actually change those tables. I'm going to click yes. You can see the asterisk is now gone, so it's saved that relationship. And let's take a look at our tables. So you'll note in your patient table, once you refresh in your columns, you'll see that there's now a gray key next to the doctor key, indicating that that is a foreign key, and it adds the foreign key identifier. So we now have a foreign key in the patient table. It also sees that we have a foreign key. Our patient key is not only the primary key, but also the foreign key. And all of this is going to match with what we see in our database diagram. Once you've completed this, we now have a physical database design. We have to do two things. One, we have to create some data. So in order to create some data, one easy way to do that, we haven't learned how to do insert statements yet, so we can use the graphical user interface to do this. If you right-click on a table and click Edit Top 200 Rows, you can type values in for each field. I've added several records to my doctor table. You can do the same on yours. notice that there's a red circle with an exclamation point that appears next to my record in the 4th row. The way this works is this record, what that's telling me is this record has not been inserted to the database. Until I click the next row, it does not commit that row. And each time you put a new row in, as you click to the next row, it'll commit the previous row. So now that I've added this data to my database, if I close it, I'm going to right-click on Doctor and just say Select Top 1,000 Rows. And you can see that that data is in my database now. This is an example of a select statement, which we're going to learn about in the next lesson. It's not important to understand it now, but it is interesting to see it, and we'll use it later on. You can now proceed to create test data for the rest of your tables. For example, the patient table, I'm going to right-click, go to Edit Top 200 Rows. So you'll notice when you try to insert a patient record, we have a foreign key constraint violation. In order to continue, we're going to have to hit Escape. So Escape will abort this insert. So you hit Escape a few times, you'll have nothing inserted, and you'll be able to close that table so we can correct the problem. So to make this change, we're going to click on Database Diagrams. Here's the saved diagram we created earlier. I'm going to right-click, click on Modify. So here's my diagram. So you'll notice that there are two relationships that may be an issue here. We have the relationship between patient and dropped patient, and a relationship between patient and patient groups assignment. Because we have a foreign key and a primary key on both sides of the relationship, and both are primary keys, imagine we try to create a patient record, but that patient key does not exist in the dropped patient record. Right now, our database is going to try to enforce that that key exists on both sides, which means I won't be able to insert a record to drop patient or patient unless the other record exists. So we have to change this relationship. Same goes for the patient group assignment. So to fix this, I'm going to click on the relationship between patient and drop patient. I'm going to right-click and go to Properties. You'll see an option that says Enforce Foreign Key Constraint, and I'm going to say No. So it will not enforce the constraint. I'm going to do the same thing for patient to patient groups assignment. I'm going to select No. You'll see that there's an asterisk now next to patient, drop patient, and patient groups assignment, where it's going to modify the schema on all three of those when we save our diagram. So I'm going to hit Control S. It's going to verify that I want to change these tables. I'm going to say yes. And now I'm going to close my diagram. Going back to my patient record, I'm going to click on Edit Top 200 Rows, and I'm going to create a record here. So here's a test record that I'm going to insert. And of course, it's really hard to test our database without some data in the database. We're only going to create a few records in this lab, but in the real world, we would use test sets to create our database. And they would contain many different names. We do some fuzz testing with those. So it would be important to have a good set of records to do testing. But for now, we're just going to use this edit option and paste some things in here or type some things in here. Now I'm trying to add a record to this patient table. I've just typed in some columns, some values for each of these columns or fields. I'm going to click the next row, which should commit that to the database. But I get an error message. And if you take a look at the error message, it says that there's a foreign key constraint with patient doctor. It says basically that the column doctor key is violating the key constraint. So if you think about it, I'm trying to add a patient with a doctor key for a doctor that does not exist. That's why we added the doctors first. You can't have patients without doctors. So I have to use a key that existed in the other table. Now I happen to know that I used the key 123 for one of my doctors. That was Dr. Jones. So this patient's doctor is Dr. Jones. I'm going to click the next column, and it commits the record. Now on this next record that I try to commit, notice that I left the middle name null. I didn't type a value in for the middle name. But when we created that table, and I'll show you over here on the left, if we look at the middle name, it allows null. So we should be able to commit this record. And it works. So use your system to create a few test records. We're going to use these test records later on. I've added these two records to my groups table. I've assigned each of my patients to a group using the group assignment linking table. So 1-24 is in group 1, patient 513 is in group 1, and patient 415 is in group 2. I've also used the drop patient table to drop, this is effectively going to remove 4-15, patient 415, from the study, even though he still appears in the patient database, in the patient table rather. This indicates that he's been dropped from the study on January 1st, 2016 for high blood pressure. To complete this lab, you're going to want to open up your diagram again. You'll take a screen capture of the diagram. This will be part 1 of your submission. And part 2 is you're going to create a script for your database. So if you right-click on your database name, select Script Database As, Create To, New Query Window. This is going to generate a script that would create your new database. Now, unlike previously, when we scripted our tables where it would create the table, this only creates the database. This would not actually create all the tables. So it's important to note that if you can't really back up a database by right-clicking and doing a script to. However, you could right-click and do a backup. I would recommend at the conclusion of each of these labs that you right-click, go to Tasks, and create a backup of your database. So when you right-click and go to Backup, the filing dialog will open up, and you can create a full backup to disk. So I usually do a full backup to disk. I click OK, and it would create a backup. That's one way to save the database. You can also right-click, go to Tasks, and detach the database. This will remove this database from your database, and you can copy the file separately and store it separately in case you need to use this database again, in which case you would simply right-click, go to Tasks, and you would attach the new database. You would do that in their database, so you could attach a new database just by finding the MDF file. For this lab submission, you can create this database script and simply turn this in, along with the screenshot of your database relationships. In Lab 5.2b, or Lab 5.2 for Group B, which is always the second half, the Group Bs, you're going to create a database on your own, but you're going to use your own entity relationship diagram that you developed previously. So you would have developed an ERD, and then in Lab 4.2, you took your ERD and created a physical design, very similar to the one that we worked with in this lab. So you'll have a design similar to this one for the Granfield College. So you're going to go through the same steps. Using your physical design, your diagram, you're going to create your tables. You're going to make sure you create your foreign keys. Make sure you're cognizant of the data types for each one of those columns. Make sure they match where you know you're going to have a foreign key relationship. And then you're going to create the relationships in the database diagram tool. You're also going to want to put some test data into your database. So you're going to follow the same steps that you did for this database, but rather than telling you which columns to use and showing you step by step, you're going to do this on your own. So that's going to be Lab 5.2. You should turn in the same thing that you turned in for this lab. So you'll turn in your create database statement as well as the database diagram from SQL. So you'll take a screenshot. If you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck with the lab.